Violence and intimidation were a common part of early elections in many now established democracies such as the UK. Our project on the causes and consequences of electoral violence in England and Wales between 1832 and 1914 seeks to examine the phenomenon of electoral violence from a broader perspective. This involves identifying and analysing incidents of electoral violence. The very first thing to ask in terms of identification, however, is what exactly counts as electoral violence. In Victorian Britain, this could be seen as a conflict between explicit and legal interpretations of what constituted violence and more implicit customary definitions which existed out in wider society. Broad-reaching legal definitions included most corrupt activities, but tended not to explicitly separate violence from wider election corruption and fraud. For instance, the 1854 Corrupt Practices Act definition of undue influence was 1. Any force, violence, restraint or threat thereof. 2. Any injury, damage, harm or loss inflicted or threat thereof or other intimidation. And 3. Any abduction, duress or any fraudulent device or contrivance which might impede the proper enjoyment of the franchise. Now this covers rioting, fights between hired toughs, damage to property, throwing things at candidates on the hustings, kidnapping voters and the like. However, it also covers things which should be considered as intimidation rather than outright violence. This includes boycotting businesses because of their allegiance, known as exclusive dealing, bribery, and impersonating voters. This is often confused by the fact that often violence and intimidation do not meet with any official retaliatory response, and this has its origins in the attitudes of the popular element towards electoral violence. Authorities often looked the other way. De jure electoral violence was often different from de facto electoral violence in 19th century elections, and newspapers often tend to capture the tension between the two. Some newspapers might condemn an incident of electoral violence as illegal, but not as illegitimate. Thus, the definition of electoral violence which we use for our project is the following. Physical damage, or the explicit and immediate threat of physical damage to persons and or property that directly results from the local and national electoral cycle. Each article should be judged on its relevance according to this definition. Types of violence covered by this definition include mass disturbances of the peace and riots, physical assault or the explicit and immediate threat of it, the illegal detainment or kidnapping of voters, also known as cooping or bottling at the time, vandalism or destruction of property or the threat of it, theft of property by force or the threat of it, and dueling. But how do we separate election violence from election non-violence? Physical damage to persons or property is included as electoral violence. Moreover, there are cases in which the threat of violence was so explicit and so immediate that they merit inclusion in our dataset. Now, I think the best example of this is stone throwing. Now, if the member of a crowd throws a stone at a candidate, then this falls under our broader definition of electoral violence, even if the stone did not actually hit its intended target. Otherwise, inclusion of such incidents in our project would be arbitrarily decided by the throwing ability of the crowd member or the speed at which the candidate was able to duck. As such, events should be included if the threat was 1. Explicit. This means an unambiguous and recorded threat from potential perpetrators. For example, if they're waving bludgeons at potential targets or making credible verbal threats of physical harm. It should also be 2. Immediate. Now this means it's likely to occur imminently during a discrete occasion, such as an individual confrontation or public meeting, potentially within minutes or an hour at most of the threat's presence. So, somebody speculating to a voter that they might get hurt if they vote for the wrong candidate at some point in the future doesn't count in either category. The might get hurt means that it's implicit, not explicit, and at some point in the future is too vague and far off to be clearly immediate. What about separating ordinary violence during elections from electoral violence? Now, a person may commit assault for reasons unrelated to the election, which merely happens during election times. Do we count this as electoral violence? The answer is a definite no, so long as there is absolutely no connection to the election. Ideally, a clear separation on the basis of perpetrators' motivations would be included in the article. The article might say something like, due to the excitement of the election, John Smith got drunk and punched a bystander. However, things like this are not always recorded, and even if recorded, are very unreliable given the biased nature of newspaper sources. As such, All instances which are connected to the local and national electoral cycle are to be included in the dataset, regardless of motivation and even if motivation is not discussed, but an electoral connection is alluded to. So, an article which has the headline "Election Murder" but makes little or no reference to the election in reporting the crime should be counted as relevant. This includes potentially accidental events. For instance, if an election canvasser is reported to have hit a random pedestrian while in charge of horse and carriage. If you think an electoral violence incident is not related to the election, but a connection is alluded to, then you should code the event as relevant, but point this out in the comments section so that we can check this manually and see whether it merits inclusion. Finally, what about separating electoral violence from political violence more generally? Now, our working assumption is that essentially all political violence taking place during election periods is electoral violence. Elections were thought to be important, if not pivotal, political events by the Victorians, and close attention was paid to their processes and outcomes. As such, political activities including demonstrations or protests which occurred during election periods were generally considered to be connected to the occurrence of contests. Overall then, electoral violence is defined by this project as physical damage or the explicit and immediate threat of physical damage to persons and or property that directly results from the local and national electoral cycle. And if unsure, then they should be coded as electoral violence, but flagged for manual checking. Now, more detailed information on the relevance and irrelevance of articles, along with examples, will be available in the handbook. When deciding if an article counts as electoral violence, consult this video and the handbook if necessary. If still unsure, then code it as a relevant article, but note this in the comments section of the platform if you think it's a borderline case. It will then be double-checked. For queries and further information, please consult our website at www.victorianelectionviolence.uk or contact us directly at victorian.electionviolence@durham.ac.uk.